Well, I guess that was a bit of a fiasco. I seem to have somehow missed my time mark for coming on here tonight. About 15 minutes late, but um, I looked at my clock and it said, I think it said 10:30. I'm like, all right, so let me do this. Oh, this is a neat feature. And I was gone, just gone. Took a look at my clock and go, oh crap, I should have been on shooting my video at whatever it was, just 2 minutes ago that I got up and scrambled over here to do this. So yeah, I sort of missed my window. Well, random musings is really the point of the night here. I've been sort of one of the things that I've been gathering on online was looking through that Kingdoms of Amalur game wiki and seeing just the sheer number of items and images for them, and snagging a few of those for artwork, inspiring artwork, that kind of stuff. Now, I'm acutely aware of the fact that when I look at these things, they're pretty small. So it's not like I can print out a big picture of one of these items and not have it look like, oh yeah, that's 12 pixels wide. I totally see every pixel on that one. No. So for the most part, it's probably for the best anyway that they're not complete ripoffs of the game pieces, the components of the computer game. But some of them are really good icons for spell books or library books or whatever kind of journals that somebody might have been using. And some of them are like good potion bottle artwork. And so there's that. There are things like rings, and they're fairly generic looking rings for the most part. So using them as indicators or tokens on a game board that you can use, that would work. I also think part of the fun thing that I want to play with in the near future that I'm sort of kind of brainstorming my way into is if you take some of those images, and I have in the past created some props and costuming stuff for fun. If I used my crafting skills to craft versions of some of these objects that you can have a physical object at the table. So a potion bottle would be fairly easy to do. And doing some things like rings and spell books and those types of things would be a fun project to do. Good Lord. Okay, so I turn the camera on and I start yawning like a crazy kid. That's awesome. Anyway. So I may end up tinkering around with making some toy or prop versions of some of these things. Just so you have like tabletop things to play with. Now, some of that stuff is going to be like generic enough. Like a book looks like a book looks like a book. I mean, it's not some hard trick to make that work out. Fantasy weapons tend to have a very distinctive look to them. If I wanted to make a prop for something in gameplay, so say I had some characters who defeated a monster and they found a dagger from a previous champion who died in the fight, that dagger might be mystical or magical in some way, and so I would craft a distinctive thing for that. I'm not going to necessarily pattern they have in game art. Most of the game art stuff for that is just so absurd. Like, you have the magical thieves' knives, and they're like this long, and they're these honking thick blades made out of some glowing blue material with galaxy patterns through the middle of it. And I'm like, that's too much. It's too much. But there's definitely some ideas in there for inspiration. Oh, God, I can't stop yawning right now. I don't know what that is. Anyway, so I actually think it would be fun to make some simple items from some of my games as I've been working on them. But yeah, it's a little bit tricky to resort. Like, I think the other thing I could easily do is make like the little quarter or $50 size tokens that you can put down on the tabletop to represent certain treasures or items. Well, I think it makes it possible for, in gameplay, keeping track of inventory better. You know, if somebody has 10 items, it's just like they're going to have way more items than somebody who has 2 or 3. And so there's some of that to play with. I'm back and forth between some of that sort of stuff, the deck of cards, and my setting building. So one of the things I want to do for my setting, I've been debating about whether or not I want to run a Dark Sun campaign. The big trick for some of this is just going to be, can I get people to join me for them? And a Dark Sun campaign would be fun to do. Maybe even just a one-off Dark Sun game might be fun to do. My campaign setting can be done as a one-off game every now and then. But the real, like, the overarching narrative that I'm looking to achieve with the game structure that I'm building. So the way I set it up is you start out as basically kids, a couple of people, a group of people. You can do it one person. If you want to do a one-person game, you totally could. And then you have the possibility of doing upwards of 4 or 5. I don't know if I want to go all the way out to 6 to 8 players. But the ability to have multiple players join the game is possible. Well, it's the goal. The goal is to have about 4 players. And you're a group of kids who are sort of apprentices to craftsmen or labor groups in a small town on a floating island that drifts above a large landscape of chaos and twisted land. And so it's sort of like this floating island is going to be something similar to a oasis. So generally speaking, when we talk about an oasis, you have a giant wasteland, desert land kind of space with no plants and animals for the most part, other than some random wild creatures occasionally. But it's just an endless slog through empty wasteland. And then you reach this point where it's a pool of water and some trees and some animals that live around it. And you pull up to that, and it's sort of like a frequent stopping place for nomads. And that's one way of doing this, is what I'm looking to do that. But in this case, what you're looking at is the tendency early on in human history of civilizations to establish cities around an oasis or a river or by the coast, places where water, food, and frequent travelers will end up. And so you start to build a city on locations like that. So what I'm looking at potentially for this is to have that kind of thing formed backwards. So you have a city that's built, and the building of the city is what elevates it off of the ground and makes it a oasis from the chaotic landscape around it. But what I'd like to have happen at that point is these floating cities as oases must have some means by which people travel as nomadic groups. So you're going to have the Trader's Bazaar and the local lord or baron, the sort of central fortress, farming lands, and animal husbandry around the city core, and then some simple surroundings. And perhaps as a city grows and its population becomes more numerous, you end up with a ability to draw in more of the landscape and convert it to part of the floating city. So maybe, there's a few satellite clusters around the city that eventually get roped into and merge with the floating city. And then you have the idea of hunting and gathering is still a part of a lot of the mentality of the medieval early classical period. So from Greco-Roman times through to King Arthur and a little bit past that point, maybe even up towards the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment. When you get to that time period, you still sort of have this, wild game is still a hunted thing. It's something people still go out and hunt. And I feel like establishing sort of hunts and resource mining, so going out to the sort of crazy chaotic landscape and gathering materials out there may still be a important factor. And so part of that would be, how do you get from a floating city down to the landscape to do these mundane tasks? These cities will be floating not just in one place, but sort of moving across the landscape. And so they are, in a sense, a nomadic city. So they can pass an area and harvest certain things and then be gone and maybe cycle back through once a century in the same area. The getting down from the floating islands to the chaotic landscape, I feel, is sort of like I want to do something like the Rainbow Bridge to Valhalla. So it's sort of you drop a drawbridge kind of situation, a mystical drawbridge down to the land below. And once you're down there, they sort of pull up their rainbow bridge and wait for the party to return from their whatever. And so I want the start of the adventure to be on one of these floating cities, minor city town kind of thing. And it's tricky because I want the city or town to be sizable enough to be a floating city where civilization exists and it drifts through the chaotic landscape below. But the mythology I built around the back end of this sort of wants it to be a podunk town, a town where there's not a lot of noteworthy things going on in the background. And so to have the thing that makes the city float is something you have to gain enough of to achieve enough of a status to warrant being separated from the chaotic landscape below. And the people who live outside of these floating cities, they're not like normal people. They're twisted and warped by the environment they live in. And so how do you get a city that's floating and lifted above this hellscape below them, but small enough that it's a nothing town for the most part? It's barely above ground, but at the same time also have it seeming to grow as it gets better. So it implies that at some point somebody lifted up a chunk of terrain, and the mechanisms I have in my brain for why that happens or how that happens says that's something you don't just do on a whim. Something has to be done that's sort of a dark secret about what makes these cities float. I mean, if you kind of have to imagine it as slaying a unicorn is what you need in order to bring this. That's not what the story is, but if you have to slay a unicorn to get a floating city to keep you above the hellscape below you, then you're certainly going to have sort of like unicorns as an endangered species that way. And if every town that has a blacksmith and 3 farmers in it is floating, then it's hard for it to be a secret that you had to kill a unicorn to get your town off the ground. And so I got to figure out how to reconcile that problem. And the main story starts with being any of these towns could be your start. And I kind of want to build the setting so that you could literally just pick a place on a map and say, like, okay, let's start a tiny little satellite town here. And when you do that, you start as teenagers, serving as servants or adolescent apprentices. And there's a sort of an implication of treasure or adventure or wonder to be found in the chaotic landscape below. So the characters sort of have to figure out how they're going to stow away or sneak out with the next gathering group that goes out to get raw materials or hunt game. So they have to figure out how they're going to escape their mundane lives and go seek something out, and in the process uncover something. Now, there may be just a quest for gold, say. That's not what it's going to be, but a quest to go get some gold that somebody shows off a gold nugget that was found when they skipped out with the last hunting party, and they found it on a riverbank, and so they want to. Other people like, oh, I want to get some too, and so you get a group of teenagers going on a gold hunt out on a river, and they sneak out with the next hunting party, and that could be one of the story adventures that you start with. But I also sort of want to set up a situation where there was, I want to say like a kidnapping, or you want to go rescue something. But the rescue a captured farmer's wife or daughter is a little cliche. And there was early on, part of my thought was you could do something like, the local farm, that several sheep have been stolen. And it's sort of like the cattle rustlers. Do you go try to capture the cattle rustlers and reclaim the missing sheep? or some villainous characters snuck into town and did some damage and then fled with something, and you have to go after them because you want to be heroes or something like that. I mean, those are potential lead outs, but the trick to some of that is, like, you don't have wolves eating the local farmer's sheep if the wolves are on the ground and the town's on a floating island. You don't have barbarian raiders coming in from the outside if they can't get up to the city. You could have bandits or a cult or something like that, firing crossbow bolts and climbing up ropes to come and attack the city from beneath. So there's possibility for some of that. And I think perhaps the best choice I can think of is to come up with 6 to 8 hooks for adventure. The gold nugget, the bandits, a raiding monster. If you make it a flying monster, you have potential. Somebody's gone missing. Somebody stole something. Something to that effect. And so your characters go out on this single adventure to a point somewhere in the landscape beneath, near your floating city. And then that story, that origin story, is the one I was building around the idea of every character starts out as a base teenager, all same stats. They have minimal hit points, a zero level character, no weapons training, no skills other than what they've been trained as an apprentice to do. And so when they go out to try to do something, save the kidnapped person, capture the thieves and retrieve the stolen item, stop the monsters that were eating the animals, or find their gold nugget from the local riverbank or whatever, when they get out to do that, they sort of gain the experience to become level 1 characters. The experience they gain lets them set their character up as a different class of character. So what I want to build this adventure as is learn the basics of how to play a character in a role-playing game. So learn what combat's like, learn what skill challenges are like, learn exploration rules, and different DMs have different ways of doing some of that stuff. But for the way I want the game to turn out, some of my methodology for some of that might be a little harder to do on a single adventure. But not only do you get the chance to develop each player's character's backstory and skills and make them go from an ordinary teenager to a level 1 hero, that's the goal of the first adventure. Now, if that's the only adventure somebody plays, that's fine. But the adventure you pursue on that level will uncover certain clues that lead you to links to another adventure that can lead further and further. There are plot threads that I want to build. A big plot thread that enmeshes the characters in one of those things that gradually over time is revealed to be like a world-shaking event. And you can do that in about 3 to 4, maybe even 5 adventures in this setting. But ultimately, this gets you from kids in a small town to adventurers from a small town to adventurers going to a big metropolis, like the capital city, and inner city intrigue, as well as maybe a few missions outside of the city, and then ultimately uncovering something very important going on in the whole that concerns the world as you know it. And ultimately, I want that setting to be the starting point for a whole major plot that also allows allows is probably the wrong phrase for that. This setting is how to describe it? I would almost put it as the equivalent of you are going through your daily life. Oh, like the Matrix. There you go. There's a good example. You're going through your daily life. You're acquiring skills like the character Neo in the movie Matrix. He's a dork who works in an office space, and on his time off, he interacts with computer hackers in the world around him. A lot of people forget that was one of the key points. One of the reasons he was brought to the attention of what is it, Carrie Moss's character and Morpheus, is because he spends time doing hacking on his computer under the name of Neo. His name was Mr. Anderson or whatever they called him in the movie. He was some schmo who worked in an office space, but on his own time, he was Neo, the computer geek. And that character goes through his life. He gets involved in adventures, and then gets noticed by other people who are noticing the adventures he's participating in. That's all backstory for the Matrix movie. But I want to play that backstory. I want the characters to have the chance to build their backstory, become the characters that would be the Neos, and then the big epic story quest that they're going on eventually, and they uncover as they go forward as these characters suddenly wakes them up from the Matrix. And so they wake up in a whole different world. And when they wake up in that other world, they have to figure out, how can I gain access back to the Matrix, get back in there, and finish the fight that needs to be fought in there? And so it's a very tricky proposition to pull off a setting like that, because what you're taking a character that players are building from the ground up in a way that most games don't let you do. I'm having to fabricate the mechanisms and rules on how I'm going to do that, just to do that. And then they're going to go through this whole process of building that character up, and then I'm going to take that character away from them and drop them into an entirely different setting with a character who's sort of the same character that they were before, but again, starting at level 0. And that's sort of a jerk move, but it's sort of key to the story that I'm trying to achieve. And I don't know how to make that a little more palatable for a player. And the other thing I keep going back and forth on is ultimately what this setting has become is, I don't want to say like Inception, because it's not quite Inception, but it's, what's a good movie that went through multiple universes, parallel universes? I'm trying to think. There was one recently. Did one of the Marvel movies do that? They did some timeline jumping. Oh, I don't know. It's very tricky to try to remember a setting that did that. I mean, there's the old TV show Sliders that I used to watch. But that's not quite what. Oh, like the other option. The other thing I equated some of this to is sort of like Quantum Leap, an old TV series where a scientist in the future builds a time machine, but this time machine works by sending his mind into the bodies of people in the past. So it's like a brain swap with somebody from the past. And so each episode is him jumping into a new body and fixing something that went wrong in the past. Now, instead of doing a time jump on this sense, I want it to be a reality hop. Now, whether or not I do that as you jump into setting 1, you have the prime setting, and then you jump into setting A, and do you do it as one gameplay session takes place in that one, and then the next one you jump to setting B, and you can cycle back to setting A at another point? Or do you do it as you jump into setting A, and you have to solve something to get to a point where it sort of reconnects you with the prime setting, but also shifts you over into setting B, where you again have to climb up and start connecting the disparate settings to the prime setting? I don't know. I haven't figured out what the right sequence for that is yet. But I do really want to be able to give the players the chance to shift between worlds and sort of have the same character, but have them different each time. It's sort of like looking at it as a if you've ever seen some of the if Batman were steampunk, or Batman were cyberpunk, or the different varieties of imagining of Batman as a story, all of those characters are still Bruce Wayne, but they're different versions of Bruce Wayne, and each one of those had to go through their own adventure to reach the point they became Batman. So I want that to kind of be the same theme of what we do with this game, where every player character is started from the ground up to establish the archetype, the one that you want to become, the one that you sort of, who is the core of your character. And then from that point on, what does that character look like in a post-zombie apocalypse setting? What does that character look like in a superhero setting? What does that character look like in a Greco-Roman mythology setting? And all the while in the background having that play out, while knowing on the upper level, the place that you once came from, there is a conflict going on that you are desperate to return to in order to win that conflict. And the question along the way is, if you had the option, you started out as the archetype that you were trying to build, and then you got broken and shoved off into a world where you're a superhero version of that character, or a survivalist in a zombie apocalypse character, or a Medusa trying to solve a important quest. If you're monsters and other creatures in different settings and different in a lot of ways, when you have the chance to explore your character by exposing them to those aspects each, when you solve the quest, when you do whatever you need to do to get to the point where you can get back to the prime conflict, do you go back to who you were before, or do you arrive as a different form that you've experienced in one of those other lives? I don't know. Like that to me is the excitement of this journey. But it's for some people, I can see where it might be kind of frustrating to build a character, lose a character, build a character, lose a character, and do that too many times. I guess you can always set it up as an option for gameplay, where instead of like Quantum Leap was he has to do a certain thing to um, be set free from the life he jumped into and jump to the next one. Sliders was set that they jump into an alternate reality and they're only there for a certain amount of time. So all they have to do is wait for the timer to kick in and jump them to the next reality. So is that the way I want to do it? I don't know that. I don't think that's really the approach I want to take with this. I don't want it to be a timer thing. Like, you can waste time. It's really easy to waste time. I don't want that to be what you end up choosing to do. And I don't want it to be just like a cyclical jumping around every 3 days to a different setting. That's possible. It's a possible way of doing it. And I may have to figure out just from the ground here. It may be a type of gameplay that works for some people to do you've got 3 months in this time. What are you going to do with your time here? Some people might like that kind of, just like, this is a world that I get to explore. I only have 3 months to do it. And if there's some sort of important factor in that world, to have that timer ticking down on them can really help an adventure. But by the same token, having you have to do something to trigger your shift to another reality. You might be able to do that one with a timer too, is what I'm actually now thinking. If you hop into a reality and the trigger you need to set off in order to slip on over to the next reality, you have to do it within a certain amount of time. Otherwise, you get stuck in that reality. I can see that being a motivating factor in gameplay. And I can't help but feel there's at least one or two other ways to do that. So event triggered, timer triggered, yeah, I don't know what the other event would be. The other type of trigger. I'll have to really do some brainstorming on that. And I might be able to do some brainstorming over the next few days. I'm back to work. Today was sort of a day off. I had some appointments to take care of and some errands and all that stuff. But for the most part, this was a day off. So I got some things done to play around with and think about today. But tomorrow, my only options are silently brainstorming to myself. I don't get a lot of time to work on projects physically for the rest of the week. But I'm hoping to see if I can make an arrangement to meet up with other YouTubers in the next week or so. And I think this Sunday is game night. 23rd, I think. Yeah. But other than that, I've got some brainstorming to do. And I'm still looking through some of my old stories and rethinking some of those, because that's just the nature of what I'm doing. The one that started out as a Crow fan fiction, I think, is the one that really has a lot of my brain in it right now. But I had a couple of other ones that I found. The Matrix one was one of them. I'll have to do some thinking about how I want to trigger events in this D&D setting that I'm building. And the other thing I need to do is what I'm doing with the main part of the new setting that I'm building is I'm doing a lot of similarities to my favorite settings. And part of that would be um, the Dark Sun setting has a very kind of wasteland with monsters all around. It turns the outside world into one giant dungeon, essentially. A dungeon without walls. And so getting from place to place is a distinctive health hazard. And I like that setting. And I like a lot of the themes they use for it. I think I've mentioned before, Dark Sun has a very John Carter of Mars, a very Frank Herbert's Dune feel to it. And part of that is people having, in Dune, you have the special abilities that certain characters have. And John Carter of Mars, John Carter's distinctive from others because of some of the things he can do. As an Earthman on Mars, he's got Earthman strength on a lighter gravity planet. He can leap giant bounds and punch like a rhinoceros. So there's an aspect of some of that I want to include. I want the wasteland. I want the tribal fighting. I want the sort of alien creatures that you confront as you go through the landscape. But the special abilities is a key factor of both Dune and Dark Sun, where the world is so twisted by events in the past that everybody looks a little different. The elves are tall, thin beings. The dwarves are beardless and hairless and stout warriors. The humans have some quirky little cosmetic mutations in a lot of cases. Unusual skin, hair, eye color, webbed fingers, pointed ears, that sort of thing. And so humans have a greater variety of unusual features. But on top of that, everybody, no matter what their race is, has developed some sort of mind ability. In D&D, it was called psionics. So everybody has a wild talent, is what they call it. And it's sort of like an ability that you have a certain number of energy points that you can use per day to do it. And I'm thinking the best way to go forward with that is to essentially give characters a single monk ability that they can do. And just give them the monk's key points that they can use. I'm debating that one too, but I want that to be part of the prime setting. And then each of the tertiary or the secondary or tertiary settings that we go through, actually, that's not a bad idea. I had set them all up as just secondary settings. But if I wanted to, I could set up tertiary settings to the secondary settings. So in order to escape the secondary settings, you have to trigger an event. But there could be a timer shift skipping around to tertiary settings. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. I'll have to brainstorm that a bit, but I'm not necessarily committing to it, but it's an idea. Where was I going with that? When you jump to the secondary settings, just like in the prime setting, you have those special wild talents that everybody has. In the secondary settings, the superhero universe, I want players to have the opportunity And the way okay, this is a little bit of spoilery because I don't think anybody who would ever play this game with me is watching this. I don't think a lot of people are watching this. But in this setting of the superhero setting, I want players to have, again, the chance to start out as teenagers. But one of the key things you have in the superhero genre is usually a couple different types of superheroes. So you have people who have encountered an object that grants them abilities. So Iron Man has his armor, Thor has his hammer. Trying to think, it's sort of like coming into the possession of a superpower, an object that makes you somebody better than somebody else. And that object sort of attunes to you, and you sort of form a symbiotic relationship with this thing that grants you power, and you are sort of beholden to it to achieve certain things. That's one type of superhero. Another type of superhero is somebody like Daredevil or Spider-Man, who they're ordinary people and they encounter some circumstance, mad science, a radioactive spider, spilled toxic waste, that changes them to become powered individuals in some way. And that's the second type of character who becomes a superhero. But Marvel especially has the mutant, one who becomes super powered just by some random chance event happening because of your genetics. So you're genetically predisposed to become a powered individual. You don't have any control over what your powers are, and generally speaking, mutants are frowned upon or treated differently. Now, Marvel also has the Inhumans, which are the result of a long-distant experiment on the human genome. I kind of hate that storyline, but whatever. I mean, there's a triggering event. You expose them to a certain type of element that causes them to develop powers. You could do that. That's doable. There's also some characters who study sorcery and gain magical powers. It's D&D. You can totally do that. So you have these different methodologies of becoming superhuman. And I want basically every player who plays a character in this game to start as a teenager and end up as one of those things. And so sort of have the characters roll at the beginning, just like you would in the Prime setting for those mind powers. But in this one, it's which kind of power are you going to develop? And from there, I want to potentially, I don't want to spoil too much about this storyline that I wanted to build up here, but the setting is a superhero setting, but it's a superhero setting in Lord of the Rings, essentially. It's if you do the standard fantasy setting, you have only humans, maybe more to the point, it should be something more like Game of Thrones or Robin Hood. You have that kind of setting where everybody's human, everybody has abilities like Daredevil's hearing or Spider-Man's ability to climb walls. But each of those, the Daredevil, Spider-Man characters are mundane enough superhero tropes to work. Now, the Superman trope or the Martian Manhunter trope is something you could do by simply saying, like, it's a whole world of humans, nobody else but humans, and then have an elf or a dwarf or a halfling as a mythical race that is the only one of their kind in the setting. But you're doing a medieval setting, you're a fantasy setting, but you're granting people superpowers. So instead of spandex costumes, they're wearing the tabards that knights wore over their chainmail, and the logo on the front of that is their superhero symbol. They wear Zorro type masks to, instead of the domino mask that we're so used to. And the setting is sort of like a medieval city, like a London or something like that, where it's large enough that you can have those metropolis type events going on within the city. But here's the trick. You have your events that cause a trigger to become a superhero. You have the magical items that somebody becomes symbiotically attached to. You have you could have the magic student, magic being rare enough that a magic student classes as a superhero. You could have the Inhuman version where it's a cult that was connected to an outside force that caused them to become elevated to a trigger. So, some arcane mage made a deal with demons from an outside realm, and they had to sire a child with some demon blood, and then that's just bred into the family, but it doesn't get triggered until you expose them to brimstone or something like that. And then they display some of their fiendish abilities that they could use for the powers of good. So a Hellboy or something like that. And then what you've got on top of that is the mutant class characters. So doing a mutant in Dungeons and Dragons, I feel like the way you have to go forward with that story is when you develop as a mutant, your power triggers a transformation into a classic D&D monster. So you could start out as an ordinary teenage human, but the moment your superhero mutation kicks in, yeah, you get a power, but it might be a power that other Dungeons and Dragons creatures usually have. So you could turn into a humanoid dragon, and so you can breathe fire, or you turn into a werewolf and you have the huge strength and near invulnerability of a werewolf, or something like a rock golem. You turn into a giant rock being, and just like that, to me, is how you do mutants in Dungeons and Dragons. And so I want the characters to not know what their fate is going to be. I want them to start out as human beings in a human city where there are powered people, and they're going around in the time of swords and shields and tabards and leggings, and there's a king and his guards, and or maybe it's a baron, maybe you're not in the major city but a surrounding city, and there's industries and intrigue and thieves and whatnot going on in the city, and you're just a teenager. Maybe during that first adventure where you're going from 0 level to 1st level, somewhere along that way, somebody spills an alchemical solution or a magic potion or fairy dust on you, and it triggers you to develop abilities. Maybe you're trying to escape a rogue or somebody when you witnessed a crime, and you're crawling through a small hidden place that you know about, and you encounter a dead body, and on that dead body is a mystical item that grants you powers. And maybe you are, uncovered somebody's spell book, and now you're studying magic to become a powerful wizard. Maybe your ancestors had a connection to fiendish entities, and you're exposed to an element that brings those fiendish elements back out. And maybe, just maybe, at some point when you're encountering things, the rest of the party is used to traveling through the city. They see superheroes and supervillains, and they see regular human beings going about their daily events. And there are stories of those horrible monsters, those orcs and those medusas and those lizard people, all those horrible creatures that live on the outskirts of humanity. They're monsters. That's what they are. Until one of the party transforms into one, because they're a mutant. And then it becomes a question of, oh, are the monsters actually monsters? Have they always been? Are they actually still? Or are they people just like us who we all just think are monsters? And I'm like, yes, that is the setting I need to build. I totally need to do that. And then to layer on top of that the fact that when you start out in that setting, you are a vestige of who you were in the first setting. Now, the second setting is going to be a little bit more like the Medusa. I call it this, the other secondary setting. The Medusa setting is going to be a little more along the lines of the classic Dungeons and Dragons setting. But because the characters are all descended from Medusa, again, we have this moment of a power that the characters have to have, or at least potentially have to have access to. So the ability of a Medusa to turn things to stone with their gaze is a power that should be in the hands of players at this point. So like the superhero powers, like the mind powers, you have this thing that should be able to potentially be triggered. Now, having different types of Medusas, I feel like it's a little bit harder to say whether or not I want that to be, if I want that to be something everybody has the same ability, or if everybody should have access to a distinctly different view of it. So I debate whether or not like one can actually turn your skin to stone, but you still are able to move, while another one can completely paralyze you and prevent you from aging, but you're still vulnerable as flesh. What versions of those do I do? I'm not sure yet. I haven't worked that mechanic out yet. The third setting is the zombie apocalypse setting. Now, I debate whether or not I want to build characters. I mean, there's the potential for an ability like in the other settings. And that ability is going to be like an immunity to the zombie sickness, or an ability to connect with the zombies, take them over like a necromancer might be able to control them. I'm not sure how to do that one yet, but each of these three settings has somebody who has at least the option of having one of multiple abilities. Everybody has a special ability. I don't know if the second and third setting, they should be the same for everybody or not. I feel like you'll lose a little bit of the fun if everybody has the same ability. Then it's just a feature of a character in the setting. I don't want anybody to be playing the game that doesn't have that special ability. I don't want somebody who is surrounded by other people with powers who's just a normal schmo. Not unless they genuinely really want to just play a normal schmo. Like Bruce Wayne is a normal human being for all intents and purposes. And he still works with a superhero setting. If somebody wants to argue they want to do a Bruce Wayne element, we can find a way to make that work. But overall, I want everybody to be able to come into the game and say like, okay, this is what I want to be able to do, and then have this ability that's pretty uniquely theirs. So that's, wow, we're at an hour. This was definitely a miscellaneous night. I did a lot of rambling about a lot of different things. I should probably call it here. An hour is definitely long enough. I will try to be back tomorrow to spread out some of the discussions of things that I'm still playing with. And I will catch you later. Take care and have a good night. Oh, come on. I told you how to do this. There we go. Take care. And good night. Good nighty. That works too.